here's the imitated passage. So you shouldn't get that mixed up with Mozart. So that work has a real distinct sound. And the Romantic composers who continued this more avant-garde Romanticism, which in the middle part of the century was described by Wagner as the music of the future. So they're trying to write something that was new, okay? And so you have this line of composers. So I mentioned that Franz Liszt was present at this premiere performance in Paris in 1830, made his own solo piano version of it, which helped to spread the popularity of the work. Liszt and Wagner then, in the early 1850s in Weimar, were colleagues, and actually Liszt's daughter married Wagner, so Liszt was the father-in-law of Wagner. And Liszt made, presented some premiere performances of Wagner's operas. Lohengrin was the one that's probably most famous. Gustav Mahler, Richard Strauss. So these are all more progressive. Sometimes you see the term radical romantics. So last composer that we're going to look at, though, is a composer who stands kind of in opposition in a sense, and that is Johannes Brahms. So we will erase their names. That's Brahms. Brahms is in the conservative camp, and what's kind of interesting is that there's a lot of heated discussion about the appropriate approach to music composition. And so there was a manifesto that was distributed. Part of it, was just the incredible, popularity of these charismatic soloists and of some of these, composers, musicians like Berlioz, who were, really flamboyant in the way they conducted the works and who wrote these very spectacular pieces. But there were a lot of composers who weren't as talented, but were also very popular, but were writing pieces of music that didn't have maybe the greatest artistic integrity. And so there was a lot of criticism of that. And so there was a manifesto that was distributed, and Brahms signed his name against the music of the future, and it created this huge controversy and stir. So you kind of have these two, camps, the more progressives and then the more conservatives. So if you look up the War of the Romantics, you can read about this. It's kind of interesting, who started it. The composer Brahms is considered to be a neoclassical composer. So Brahms, the dates of his life, if you remember the number 3, you can remember this easily. So he was born in 1833 and died 3 years before the turn of the century, 1897. He's a German composer. Was born in Hamburg, and then he died in Vienna. So, as I've mentioned, Vienna is always associated with the more classical style of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert. So, Brahms continues that approach, and what that means is that he was someone who was a great master of classical forms. So he followed the same forms that Beethoven used. And so I'm going to give you just some characteristics that are classical. And then other characteristics that are romantic. So Brahms' sound is entirely romantic. His harmonic vocabulary, his rhythmic patterns. So we'll put here harmony, the melodies, rhythms. In fact, we'll look at one particular type of rhythm that has to do with syncopation that's called hemiola. And this was a type of syncopation that Brahms used quite a bit, so much that you'd say it's a characteristic of Brahms' music. So an example of a hemiola is you typically find it within the context of a triple meter. So here in 3/4, and by the use of ties or accents, you make the meter feel like it shifts to duple. So if you're going along 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, that's an example of a hemiola, shifting that pulse. So in general, the romantic intensity of expression is definitely present in Brahms' music. So he has that thoroughly romantic sound. But some things that are more classical. Number one is his mastery and use of classical forms. Another characteristic is his use of absolute music. So he wasn't writing program symphonies. Another characteristic is just the type of orchestra that he wrote for, and basically used the same orchestration as Beethoven. So you're not going to hear bells off stage or harps or Brahms. And then the final characteristic has to do with just the classical technique, but he was a tremendous master of counterpoint. So Brahms is writing in the second half of the 19th century, and so he kind of gives then a summation of the Romantic movement here, still, through kind of the perspective of the classical era. And his life is very interesting. He grew up as a teenager playing in kind of the saloons of Hamburg. He was a very talented pianist, and he went on a tour with a violinist whose name was Rimini, and they played concerts. One concert was attended by the most famous violinist of the Romantic era besides Paganini, and that's Joachim. And so this Rimini was Hungarian, and would play the gypsy kind of music. And Joachim also was Hungarian, and that's an element in Brahms' music that's more exotic, like the Hungarian dances that he wrote. And so, at any rate, at this meeting with Joachim, Joachim was good friends with two of the leading musicians in Germany in the 1830s and 1840s, and that's Robert and Clara Schumann. And Joachim said, you should go and meet Robert and Clara Schumann because they would really be impressed with you. And so Brahms did. In 1853, he traveled to Dusseldorf, where they lived, and he spent 6 weeks with the Schumanns. And at this point is the very end of Robert Schumann's life. So he died in 1856. The last 2 years of his life, he was in an asylum. He had a final mental collapse. So it was one of the last, lucid phases of Schumann's life, but Schumann had created a music magazine in the 1833. It was called Die Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, the New Music Journal. So Schumann was the editor and the publisher, and also wrote a lot of the articles for this music magazine that he published. So, this is the most famous music magazine of the 19th century, for sure. It's the most well-known. And so Robert Schumann had sold this in 1843. And so he founded it, and then he edited it, and was really involved with it for 10 years. But since he had sold it in 1843, he hadn't really been associated with it. And one thing that just really upset Clara was the person he sold it to then was a huge Wagner fan, and was one of the people then that was singing Wagner's praises. And she couldn't stand Wagner. Wagner had kind of a obnoxious personality, and so anyway, that's kind of how that developed. But in 1853, when Brahms met the Schumanns, then it moved Robert so much that he wrote this essay that was entitled New Paths, in which he praised Johannes Brahms. And there's just been all this discussion about who is going to pick up the mantle, who can ever write a symphony as well as Beethoven, or continue with that Beethoven tradition of genius. And Robert Schumann predicts that Brahms will be the composer who's going to be able to do that. Successor of Beethoven. And so this made Brahms immediately famous in European musical circles. Brahms was very self-critical, and so he pretty much destroyed all of his early compositions with the exception of just a few works at this point. And he was working on his 3 piano sonatas. So he only wrote 3, but they're all huge works. And these were works that he then had advice from Robert Schumann, who gave him some tips for, what ways I could strengthen particular passages, and Schumann helped him to get them published. So this prediction was made in 1853, but then it took Brahms 20 years to finish his first symphony, because he just couldn't complete it. He couldn't come up with, the ideas that he felt really expressed what he wanted to express. And so in total, Brahms wrote only 4 symphonies. So 1873 was the first symphony, and the others didn't take as long to compose, obviously. But one tragic thing that happened is that Robert Schumann then passed away. Clara was 9 years younger, so she was born in 1819, but that made her 14 years older.